way to the spring 2010 review. We do 2 reviews a year, and this is in the northwest corner of the state in a very small town up near the Canadian and Idaho borders. A key element of the way the Montana team does reviews is that the entire team, which is almost 20 people, travels to the location, the community in which the homicides took place. It's an enormous undertaking, and one that if we didn't feel so strongly about it, it'd be far easier to do a review where we'd always go to the same community. But we learn a whole lot more by going to the town itself. The best available space to accommodate a team of our size was actually a bowling alley, and that got lots of attention as people arrived. It actually has turned out, the space has turned out well.
Okay, everybody, yellow sheet of paper with our agenda.
Fatality review is a way of identifying those homicides and suicides caused by, related to, or somehow traceable to domestic violence. And we review them very closely, quite meticulously, with a view to introducing preventive interventions.
We work in honor of the victim and the victim's family.
We are committed to confidentiality.
We avoid accusations or finding fault.
We operate in a professional manner.
We share responsibilities and the workload.
Very good.
We'll see in states like Montana an eclecticism, a real richness in terms of team membership. We found, for example, that in some communities, more battered women had contact with their pastors than they ever did with law enforcement or advocates.
We learned about the need to incorporate a pastor on our group, but also that was an opportunity to take then Warren, the pastor that's on our team. He has a voice to then approach other pastors throughout Montana to educate and provide guidance in terms of what might be helpful in dealing with families struggling with domestic violence.
Another is to construct a timeline, not so much just of the final days or hours before the tragedy occurred, but we actually will begin with the birth of both of the individuals, marriage, the birth of the children, key events, of course, leading up to the deaths. And then the second part of the review invites local law enforcement, local victim advocate, local shelter staff in to look over this timeline and help us identify gaps. Perhaps we have dates wrong. This is a series of deaths, 3 deaths, including the suicide of the perpetrator. So he killed his girlfriend, her 12-year-old son, and then himself. So that poses some challenges that are not there in a review where the perpetrator is still alive. So we and law enforcement are having to construct the review only with what we have left after the tragedies are over.
The arrival times are from, I think, your reports.
Okay,
but correct us, you guys.
You have to be a little careful because a lot of times the dispatch times are not accurate because they might write those down afterwards, especially when they're very busy.
So tell us what you guys know and think.
And once local members understand that it's confidential, that none of this will be publicized, then they're more willing to bring us information. And the flip side of that coin is then when the community decides that something needs to change as a result of these deaths, those work best from a grassroots perspective rather than mandated by the states. There's always more information in the community than makes it into reports.
And tell us about the guns. There were many, many guns in the house. Were they loaded?
Yes, well, the guns were loaded. They had one on the bipod by the window, and then there was a whole bunch, probably 6 or 7 behind the first door, plus a handgun on the bed and a holster from the handgun they used on the bed at the end of the house. Yeah.
We go to the community, we meet the people individually, and when we make recommendations after every 2 years to the legislature, it goes right to the legislature from the Attorney General's office. And I don't think somebody who works locally often has that kind of opportunity to provide input.
Should we move on to talking about the future and what we would recommend in the future?
I mean, I think the one thing that stands out from this case is obviously the danger that a stepchild is in when you're in a domestic violence situation. I mean, this child obviously was in a huge amount of danger.
What appears happened is the perpetrator shot his girlfriend once and then emptied the gun into this young boy, save one bullet which he used for himself as well, but many shots into the boy, far beyond whatever would be needed to kill him if that was merely the goal. And it seems to indicate that shooter had strong antagonistic, unpleasant feelings towards the boy. There's indications that the boy was on the phone, whether he was dialing 911, his grandparents, a friend, it's not clear, but 2 of the bullets actually go through the cell phone and kill the boy as well. So he appeared to be reaching out. We're not sure who was killed first, but that certainly did not do anything to lessen the killer's anger towards him.
Policy change is hugely important, but I think it's the active participation with the team. This is an extraordinary group of people, and it amazes me how everyone has something different to say. Everyone participates actively.
I work with hundreds of organizations that are trying to move mountains. This group's doing it partly because they have this great affinity to and with each other. You see the cooperation going on? Everybody helps.
At the end of that process, the documents will be shredded and review team members will be instructed to destroy any digital information that they have in accordance with the statutory provisions of the Fatality Review laws.
One of the results of Montana's team maturing and focusing our system, perfecting our system over the 7 years that we've been doing this is that we spend a fair amount of time interviewing family members, both on the victim side and the perpetrator side, as we're doing a review.
We can read what's in the paper, we can read the autopsy reports and focus on kind of the criminal aspect of his history or her history and stuff, but we still don't know who these folks are.
We began with the very first review we ever did, which was the Mosier case, the killing of Michelle Mosier and their 2 children by Rocky Mosier, her husband, what we call a familicide.
Many team members are concerned and nervous about approaching family members because they don't want to re-traumatize those people. What we found from asking family members is that they appreciate often being included.
I didn't have any reservations because I just really want her story to make a difference. I guess one of the things that I really found that it was healing in a way to talk to somebody that really wanted to hear all the facts and really understand what happened with my daughter. I felt that it was really just kind of cathartic and healing in a way to be able to tell somebody that really did want to hear and was not judgmental at all.
I use a lot of explanations that, we're not here to determine guilt or innocence. We're not here to sensationalize anything. We're only here to understand. And many times with the families of the perpetrator, they're very guarded because they're used to being judged or feel like they've been judged. And so my explanation that we are trying to look at ways of preventing this in the future often is the turning point.
Connie just listened. She just listened. She asked me, direct questions, and I know in the time that we spent together, I veered off quite a bit. I don't know how long she thought the process would take, the conversation. I think we talked about 3 hours. She just allowed me to talk, and she listened, and she was very empathetic. I think she was able to see the pain, and she was very non-judgmental. She recognized that this was a person that was important to us, that Rocky was important, a person that was important to us. And He wasn't always the monster he became. And she was also very encouraging. Connie encouraged me to share my story and to use it in a way that might help other victims.
You know, the insights that the family members have are just nuggets of gold in terms of the pattern. And the Mosier case was an excellent example because they were very mindful of dates, and so you could just see as we were developing the timeline how the tension was building.
One of the things we did in those cases at that time is that we did a lethality assessment. We had a forum where after we interviewed victims and talked to defendants and looked at criminal records and did all that, that we actually laid out what is the lethality. It rated very high on a lethality scale. The whole case did, given that history. I actually put on the bottom, this is a homicide waiting to happen, and I don't know what we're going to do about that.
The first exposure I had was the Mosier review, and it was just, well, it was enlightening, but it was also very, very depressing. Extremely depressing when they passed around the photographs of the little boy and the little girl with their gunshot wounds on the autopsy table. It was pretty much more than I could take. I asked Mr. Dale on the way to lunch that day if they were going to start passing out antidepressants before the next review, because it was pretty gruesome.
We hardly ever in law enforcement find out the reason why for crimes. And there really isn't a defined reason why in any domestic violence situation, but we can at least see the factors that led up to it. We can see risk factors in lives. I can educate other women in similar situations, and I was able to do that. And probably the most striking thing for me was that I learned that almost 100% of the time, the fatality occurred after the woman had announced that she was going to leave.
She just kept saying she was going to wait till the kids got older and she would leave. And then when they got married, she called us the night before and said they were going to go ahead and get married the next day. And I said, Michelle, why? Why are you marrying him? And she said she needed to for financial aid for school. She had gone to the college and talked to them about financial aid. They wanted her parents' income information, and she refused to give it to them because she said, my parents don't support me. I live with him and he supports me. And they said, well, they couldn't count his income because they weren't married. So she said, fine, I'll be married by the end of the week and I'll bring the marriage certificate back to you. And I always thought it was so incredibly ironic that she married him in order to get the financial aid to go to college, to educate herself and leave him.
When a young person is cut down in the prime of life, they finally are taking some steps to move from dysfunction to function, from poverty to making their way in the world, and those very steps are what threaten the perpetrator, and that little spark, that little flame of life is taken away. Those are really demoralizing for me.
There's a scab that is healed over, but just bringing it up or being called for this interview 7 years later, I recognize that it certainly brings up the pain and intensity of regret and remorse for really being unable to bring out a better outcome for this family than what we could in this case. Putting aside the emotions and looking at it from an objective case study, yes, it was cathartic.
It was very eye-opening and very humbling, and it changed the way I did cases. It changed the way I looked at families, still to this day. In terms of working within a single agency and working within a community, again, this case defined what I want out of my community. I think anytime a provider works in a bubble, it's no good. And I think sometimes because of the volume of cases, or because we have a singular goal in mind, or because we think we have all the keys to the kingdom, we don't really pay attention to all of the other things that are interacting with families or people, or that should be interacting with those people.
Traditionally, groups that don't necessarily get along very well. Here, when we're talking about individuals, they do get along, and that has led to some important changes. An example would be that in Montana, when a person is arrested with partner or family member assault or PFMA, they're going to spend the night in jail or the weekend in jail because that'll be the next chance they have to bond out. And the advocate was telling the judge that when the offender was seen at 8:30 in the morning, that offender would then be back home before the advocate had a chance to talk to the victim. And the judge had never thought of that before and said, that's easy enough to change. I'll just move that initial appearance till after lunch, and you'll have all morning then. And so something as simple as that, as informal, it doesn't cost anything, it doesn't take an act of the legislature, would not have occurred if these individuals representing their professions weren't sitting there.
My scope of vision was probably pretty narrow, coming strictly from law enforcement, even though I'd spent at that point probably 17, 18 years in law enforcement by the time I participated. What happened was all the rest of the shades were opened, and I could hear from everybody else what their views were, especially when I started hearing from domestic violence advocates.
We believe that most of the changes that need to occur will begin at the local level rather than the governor or the attorney general or the legislature saying you must do that or you must not do that. We have found that working with local representatives is the most effective way to try to change things, and after all, that's the purpose of the Fatality Review. It's not merely to look at this tragedy, but to learn what we can to change the future, to inform law enforcement practices or victim advocacy or judges, to identify some things that can then be extrapolated statewide to try to make victims safer and hold offenders accountable.
The best ideas don't come from this office. The best ideas come from people in the field working together. One area where I think that we are really making a difference is the Hope Card Project. And the Hope Card Project was one of the recommendations from our Fatality Review Commission.
It's a coded card with the picture of an offender. It has a description of the offender with the identifying characteristics, and it has all the details of an order of protection. And it's something that a victim can carry around that has currency with law enforcement and the system, that is readily identifiable, is verifiable, and has detailed information about the terms of the order. This is an incredibly simple, tangible benefit that came out of a case review, a fatality review in the state of Montana. There are numerous practical examples like this from across the country.
The Fatality Review Commission in Montana, I think, is one of the success stories that we've had with Violence Against Women Act grants. As the Chief Law Enforcement Officer, I know that we can't just prosecute or arrest our way out of issues. We need to investigate and understand what causes the situations with domestic violence. Where does this safety net that we've tried to build, where does it fail? And where can we learn, both as law enforcement officers, social services providers, victims witness advocates, and legislators?
I think it's an incredible use of federal funding, quite frankly.
Now looking back, in my 20 years of law enforcement, it's probably the most powerful day and a half I've spent.